All right, 22 protesters killed. What is happening? They were both trying to add me at the same time. All right, 22 protesters killed in a fight to change Kenya, and calls for President Ruto to step down. Welcome to This Week in Africa, a collaborative effort between Authentic African and African Stream. We break down this week's breaking news and its impact on Pan-Africanism and Africa's independence. Today, we report on the recent deadly protests in Kenya against a controversial finance bill proposed by President William Ruto's government. The protests, primarily led by young activists opposing tax hikes, have resulted in at least 23 fatalities and numerous injuries as police clashed violently with demonstrators. On June 25th, 2024, violence escalated when protesters stormed the Parliament building in Nairobi, prompting the police to respond with tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition, resulting in multiple deaths. The Kenya Medical Association initially reported just 5 deaths and 31 injuries, but the death toll has since risen. Among the victims have been young folks and folks of all ages. The Kenyan Human Rights Commission condemned the police's use of lethal force and called for its accountability. Despite the crackdown, protests have spread all over 30 counties, with demonstrators remaining defiant and determined to fight against corruption and for their future. So stay tuned as we discuss this in more detail and other stories from around the continent. But before we do, we like to start with introductions for those of you who aren't as familiar. And today, something a little bit different. We have 2 folks that you guys might be familiar with if you've been following the live. We will turn it over to ladies first. So Inem, if you'd like to do your introduction, and then to William.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be on again. I unfortunately missed the last episode because I was traveling around the Sahel. But for those who don't know me, I'm Inem Richardson. I am a journalist with African Stream. I'm based in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. I'm also the president of the Thomas Sankara Center here in Ouagadougou and a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party.
And William.
I'm William Sakao, Inem's colleague. It's a real pleasure to be back again for the 2nd time running. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I am Joe Hatagwa, founder of Authentic African. It's a Pan-African platform meant to bridge the gap between Africans on the continent and those living in the diaspora. And I help folks who are looking to move, visit, or travel to the continent of Africa. And so to get right into today's stories, we have a lot to go over. And as you guys all know, if you've been following the platforms, there's been a lot happening in Kenya and, and some things happening in the AES. William was on the ground in Kenya and is on the ground in Kenya. Inem was in Mali and she is currently in Niger. So she has, done some on the ground reporting. And so we're going to bring those stories to you today. So first, we want to get right into the headline story of what's been happening in Kenya. And in particular, we want to start with explaining the protests in terms of the hard numbers. So, I'll give a little context before we jump into the video, but a recurring theme during the past 2 weeks of protests across Kenya against the IMF-backed finance bill has been government corruption and waste. Police arresting demonstrators and tear gas lobbed just a street away. A protester in Nairobi helped us better understand how imprudent spending adversely affects society. So focusing his complaints on the judiciary, the argument is a microcosm of Kenya's government at large. So it gives you an example of Kenyan legislators and how highly paid they are relative to the average living standards in the world. Many hospital patients and people who've fallen ill have needlessly died over the last year, a direct consequence of a third of Kenya's budget being squandered through corruption. Likewise, scores of children have been deprived of an education as funds to build schools have simply disappeared from government accounting. Unlike Kenya's current political economic debacle, an alternative blueprint was offered decades ago. Upon taking office, Burkina Faso's revolutionary president, Thomas Sankara, disposed of the government's luxurious fleet of Mercedes-Benz cars for modest economic Renault 5 vehicles, which were used as official government transportation. In fact, the Renault 5 was the cheapest car in Burkina Faso at that time. Contrary to this fiscal responsibility measure, Kenya's President William Ruto aspired to tax bread and sanitary pads with this now scrapped IMF-backed finance bill. So let's jump into this video, and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
Die because of 20,000 shillings, yet Ruto wears a watch that is 6 million. How much can 6 million do? And this also goes to our Chief Justice. Chief Justice, Martha Koome, you bought a vehicle that is worth 30 million Kenya shillings. And as our Chief Justice, I want us to do it mathematically. 30 million divided by 12. How many chief magistrates could you hire? We don't have an issue of judicial backlog. We have an issue of misappropriation of resources. It's very, very, very clear. If for 30 million, if you were to pay a magistrate 250,000 Kenya shillings, it's still petty cash, okay? You'd be able to clear more than 48,000 cases. It's very, very, very simple. 30 million divided by 250, okay? Then you say you'll get 120. From the 120, then divide that by 12. You will get 10. So you'll be able to get 10 clear magistrates. 10 magistrates, 20 files in a day, 20 working days. That's 20 times 20 times 10. That's 500 times 12. That's 48,000 cases that could be able to be resolved through your one vehicle. Through your one vehicle. Yet, we have MPs driving 50 million, 30 million. One car could be able to clear judicial backlog.
Okay, and that was by the numbers. Now, William, you were there on the street. You actually conducted this interview. Can you give a little bit more context to this particular discussion in terms of the judicial backlog, and just kind of remind us again of the protests and what it was like on the ground, because you were there in person throughout it. I think the first time we talked, you had just mentioned you had been tear gassed. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you on this particular video and kind of the broader context of the protests in general.
Sure. So for the past 2 weeks, actually much more than that, considering the amount of time that mobilization took place on social media, Kenyans have been vehemently against a proposed finance bill, which was backed by the IMF. In January, the IMF issued a report to Kenya's treasury in which it said, here are some recommendations, of course. There could be potential political unrest as a result of these policies, but we do recommend that you still push through with the recommended policies. So in one way, we can basically say, we can see the IMF's fingerprints in the 2 weeks of protests, in the 2 weeks that, Nairobi or Kenya basically has been unstable. But further from that, the bill was looking to raise $2.7 billion. And the argument was that, why are you trying to tax sanitary pads? Why are you trying to increase the prices for diapers? Why are you trying to make specialized healthcare more expensive, which means, treatment of illnesses like cancer will suddenly, shoot up. And instead, we have a sector that's gobbling up a third of Kenya's budget. How does it make sense that, you go squeezing the most vulnerable people? Kenya's an African country, and Africa at large, has a high prevalence of period poverty. So in a country with blatant or prevalent period poverty, there's a bill seeking to increase the price of sanitary pads by 16%, instead of trying to make it as affordable as possible. And keep in mind, while this is happening, we have the office of the spouse of the prime cabinet secretary, an unconstitutional office. So you have all these governmental agencies, which is not addressed. You have all this corruption, which is not addressed. But it's the poor person who has to pay through the nose. And remember, it didn't just start, let's say last year or this year. I feel the protest or the outburst that we saw of the Kenyan masses was a result of more than 2 years of it bubbling up. I feel the only reason President Ruto, for example, got into power was that he used a class analysis. He basically said, since independence, we've had like 3-4 families who've dictated the policies or what's allowed or what's not in the country. So his whole thing was, my father is not a member of the dynasty. I'm just a nobody. So by electing a nobody, it's basically power to the masses. But remember, this is the same guy who has a net worth of around $480 million. So it's also in a bit of blame for Kenyans. How do you get blindsided by a guy worth that much that, he's not a member of the elite? He obviously was. And the best evidence of that was that after he got into power, this man that basically complained throughout his campaign period that, why raising taxes on the poor, it's unfair. Suddenly, his very first act was to cut subsidies to fuel. Sounds like the IMF. We've seen over the past 2 years, the school fees paid to universities have increased drastically. People used to pay around 30,000 shillings. I can't quickly convert it to dollars. Are now paying between 100,000 and 300,000. The basic IMF footprints of basically, defiant healthcare, defiant education, do all this. But now, this, I think, the main point is that the IMF is complicit in this corruption. Kenya has gone under austerity programs, under structural adjustment programs since the 90s. Corruption has been in this country since 1964. But corruption has never been a hindrance. They might say, Kenya is corrupt. We call upon the Kenyan government to curb corruption, all that stuff. But in the end, they keep fueling the beast. They keep feeding the beast. We saw President Ruto when he went to Biden a few weeks ago. He was basically given more than $500 million to combat corruption. You're giving the government that is corrupt money to curb corruption. I mean, how does it make sense? Unless, of course, you're not interested in solving corruption. So I think here we've seen people draw the link between, yes, it's a local issue, but the IMF is involved. And even higher than the IMF, I'd like to point out the fact that the US has veto power over the IMF. The US has more than 15% a stake, and you need more than 85% to make any meaningful decisions in the IMF. So you can basically say the IMF is an American organization which dictates terms for African countries that squeeze poor people but do not focus on issues such as corruption. So yeah, that's the bit of context behind the protest. We've had 39 of our fellow youth killed. We've had abductions from a president who keeps telling youth that, I'm willing to dialogue. But in the middle of the night, almost every single day for the past week, there's missing people. There's reports being filed. My brother got abducted by plainclothes officers who are heavily armed, and this is coming from the same person who's like, say, yes, you're my children. I understand you've grown big. You now have ideas. We should sit together and discuss. But he's still abducting you. So yeah.
Okay, and then and thank you for that context. I think that was really important and really giving us an update from live from on the ground. Specifically, this video talks about the judiciary, and he mentions that one car could solve X number of cases. Can you help us understand what exactly he's talking about there? Because for someone from the outside, it may be hard to draw the connection between the two. And then what is he talking about in terms of the judiciary?
So Kenya has a huge backlog of cases, due to a shortage of magistrates. And one of the things President Ruto has said after he withdrew the bill following pressure is that, he'll have to embark on austerity. But now this is, again, another bit where it's so disingenuous, because while he says he's curbing austerity, it does not mean curbing government excesses. It means he will no longer hire teachers. He said 100,000 teachers will not be paid in the month of July because Kenyans rejected the finance bill. It's a classic case of gaslighting. So while he is preaching austerity on one hand, it's not austerity for the rich, it's not austerity on government excess, it's austerity on social services, it's austerity on public spending, it's austerity on healthcare spending. We have doctors who've been striking for more than 3 months now. They still haven't been posted. And this is based on an agreement the government had with the doctors all the way from 2017. To date, the government hasn't fulfilled. We have children dying in hospital due because we don't have enough doctors, nurses. So it's not that Kenya has an excess or overcapacity of doctors. But meanwhile, this same man who says he's interested in developing Kenyan youth, his biggest move basically is telling Kenyan youth, I'm going to look for jobs for you in Saudi Arabia. I'm going to look for jobs for you in Germany, in South Korea. So it's really messed up. But now coming back to the particular context of the judiciary, as I said, the judiciary has a backlog. And while the government says, we are cutting in, we have to embark on austerity because you guys don't want us to tax you more, we have the magistrate walking around, driving around with a car worth 30 million shillings. Why is that necessary? Look, Kenya is an African country. We see the Prime Minister of Netherlands go to work in a bicycle. This is not even the president, this is just the Chief Justice, but she has to roll around in a car worth 30 million. The very same countries that give Kenya aid their governments live more within their means than even Kenya. And it's even more shocking when you realize that per capita, when you compare the average living standards to how much the legislators are paid, Kenya is the highest in the world. 97 times the average, cost of living, or the average, how the average Kenyan lives. So you have all this gulf, but the government doesn't want to address that. It's instead, looking to press the people even more.
Well put. Thank you for all that context. And that's difference is staunchly different. I was not aware of that number, the 97 times. So, and the most in the world. That is, and the people are aware of it. It's clear, right? I mean, this is why these protests are happening. Okay, yes. So I thought we could get into the next video where you have an everyday person talking about the fact that he can't date, he can't marry, talking about what it's like. I think that's a good segue into the fact that the average person can't do what normal people expect to do, considering the financial situation there in Kenya. So Kenyans are taking stock of this momentous 2 weeks in June, during which the country's youth cemented their place in national politics. Protests against International Monetary Fund-backed tax hikes forced President William Ruto to bow to pressure, announcing on the 26th of June that he declined to sign a controversial finance bill. But Kenyans are skeptical about Ruto's U-turn amidst the cost of living crisis and increasing numbers of unemployed people. Ruto says government revenues will experience a share drop without tax hikes to help cover payments for $80 billion in domestic and foreign debt. Protesters have vowed to keep up the pressure and are now demanding major political reforms. So for now, an uneasy calm pervades as Kenyans ponder the country's political and economic future. So let's jump into this video of
brutality against
everyday
protesters.
Kenyan talking about what life is like for him under the current financial circumstances.
After a week of police brutality against protesters, Kenyans are not convinced that President William Ruto's refusal to sign the finance bill means better times are ahead.
The matter on how Ruto has taken the situation, this guy is very clever. Even though he has refused to sign the bill, definitely after 21 days, it will become a law, meaning we'll have to adopt unto it, and as the youth, we'll have nothing to do.
On 26 June, Ruto announced he would not sign onto the bill that would have hiked taxes, yielding to pressure from mainly youthful protesters who stormed parliament amidst nationwide demonstrations.
I concede, and therefore I will not sign the 2024 finance bill.
Ruto had previously said the government needed additional tax revenue to shore up an economy in $80 billion of debt. Anger over a cost of living crisis and wasteful government spending has birthed a youth-led movement calling for major political overhaul. Despite Ruto's appearing to decline the bill, protesters have vowed to keep up the pressure.
People actually dying, and I've done some retreats actually. People who lost their loved ones last and said we're going to go back to the streets. Because they're already dead actually. They're dead men walking. You meet young kids who say, I can't date, I can't marry. A girl says I can't even get a child because the economy is not viable for me to get a child.
So I mean, that speaks to what it's like to be a student, what it's like to be just an everyday person in Kenya. And I think William, you rightly articulated the fact that the difference between those people in parliament and different roles in government, how different their lives are to the average person. Any comments on this particular video? Just the student talking about his experience, and also the fact that from what he said, that regardless of him signing it, in 21 days it will still go into law. Can you speak to that piece? Because I wasn't aware of that, and I think it's important because I think we were all happy to hear that he didn't sign it. But if that is the case, what does that mean?
So I think maybe I'll start with the last part. The president said he withdrew the bill, but the fact is he doesn't have the power to withdraw. He can either assent to it or reject it. So the only person who can withdraw it is the person who tabled it to parliament, which of course wasn't the president. Now, the twist comes in that the parliament is on recess until July 23rd. So they're not convening any meetings, and there doesn't seem to be any indication that a meeting will be convened to basically withdraw the bill. So look, our president is a very, very sly man. This could be just a ploy that, just let time run out, let the anger dissipate. After 14 days, after 21 days, it will still become a law and the taxes will be in effect. And just to maybe also show another instance of the dishonesty, a few days after, all the protests, there comes murmurs from the EAC, since you're part of the regional economic bloc, that the very taxes that were avoided in the finance bill on the diapers, on the sanitary pads, are now going to be in the EAC though. So while we escaped it in Kenya, it's still going to apply in the EAC. So it just shows the president doesn't seem really genuine about addressing these things. And the best example is that he doesn't have the power to withdraw it. The best thing he could have done is basically force the speaker, who, I think they are basically friends with. They helped him campaign during the election period. He could have basically told the speaker, convene the parliament as soon as possible and have this withdrawn. But at the moment, it doesn't seem that that's what he's trying to do. Now, on to the other video, I think that's basically the human cost. That's basically the face of austerity, the face of structural adjustment programs since the 90s. Maybe using the example of education. I remember back when my father was in uni, and he told me it wasn't a loan. They're basically being given an incentive for them to be students in uni. It wasn't a loan, it was basically a grant. And this was afforded to university students. Then the SAPs kicked in and it was changed from a grant. Now it had to be a loan. Basically, the government gave you this money, you had to pay them back once you got employed. Now it's getting even worse, where you have fees tripling by between 5-10 times. Already it was difficult for many families in Kenya to send their children to university. Now this has simply shut the door to so many of them. And now, looking at stuff like, starting a family, in terms of healthcare, where do you take your pregnant wife as a poor Kenyan? How do you make sure she gets all the care that an expectant woman is supposed to receive? If you look at stuff like the taxation on diapers, how are you gonna, manage to buy both diapers and feed for your family? So the moment, it's easier to just forego these things. And it's not something that young people take pride in, because these are milestones that our parents covered, that our grandparents covered, and we feel like we're missing out. We also wanna have family. We also wanna, have that form of community. But that video just basically puts a human face to the policies imposed by the IMF since the 90s. They've done nothing except impoverish Kenyans for decades.
Wow, well put. I mean, you gave a lot of context there. I know we haven't yet had a chance to hear from Inem from the first video. So with this second video, any thoughts on this and the first video? As someone who's living in a country that's gone through a revolution, has had multiple protests, you've been speaking to people on the ground. How do you see what is happening in Kenya in terms of the youth protesting and really making their voices heard?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, for me, what really stood out in that first video is like the contrast, I guess, between the reality in Kenya with somebody like Ruto, who is a very like staunchly neo-colonial leader to such an extent that he has become the first East African president, or the first African president south of the Sahara, to have that status of being an official non-NATO U.S. ally. And to see, like, you know, that in contrast with somebody like Ibrahim Traore, I don't know, to me, it's just a very stark contrast, because, you know, Ibrahim Traore like opted out of having the presidential salary. So it's like he is cutting his own money or potential earnings to redistribute that to like to internally displaced people out here. So just to see like the reality of a president, and Ruto, honestly, unfortunately, is more of the typical example of the kind of presidents we see, not even just in Africa, like generally in the world, but also in Africa, you know, where unfortunately there's like there's high levels of corruption, and there's just high levels of spending at the cost of the majority of the people. So just like, it makes me just really think of that kind of contrast between the two states. But you know, Burkina went through it too, and it's been through a process of insurrection and uprising, kind of like we're seeing in Kenya, and you know, high levels of organizations that have been able to you know, topple people like Blaise Compaoré out here. And so hopefully this is kind of ultimately the path that Kenya takes, because I think, you know, even if whether the bill is signed or not, I think Ruto is very clear about where he's positioning himself, you know, what his interests are, what his geopolitical interests are, what his material interests and, you know, personal interests are. So it's like, whether it's this bill or something else, he's going to keep having that kind of anti-people position. And so, you know, I hope that Kenya and the protests turn out like Burkina, because we also do see protests that kind of die out. So like, we need to see that flame continue, and we need to see like high levels, I think, of organization. So this will be sustained. So those are just kind of my thoughts, you know, thinking about this from a continental perspective. I had a conversation this morning, real quick, at our editorial meeting with African Stream, where we kind of compared what's happening in Kenya a little bit to NSARS. So you know, I think that's an interesting thing to like look at and to maybe like study in this moment, and to see like, you know, how can we kind of learn from that as Africans, like the NSARS movement, because it was similarly around like a specific policy, but then also targeted towards the government at large. So maybe this could be like a spark that could go further than that, and have that clarity. And I think I am already seeing it in some of what the protesters are saying, that Ruto himself needs to be removed.
Right. Fair. And just for context, for those who are watching, NSARS movement was in Nigeria. It was a special police tactical unit that was, I don't know how to describe them other than like terrorists, you know, police terrorism. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, but it was quite aggressive. Part of the reason why I didn't move to Nigeria, by the way, when I was looking at where I was deciding to move in West Africa. And of course, there are still some challenges. I think that it was a wake up call. And you notice that there have been further protests, and it seems like the people of Nigeria, especially the young people, are more politically involved. Unfortunately, it hasn't led to much change in policies or political leadership. In fact, the same party is in power in the next administration now in Nigeria than was in the previous. But at the very least, people are much more politically involved. And I think that's kind of the start of a sea of change. So yes, I agree. I think this looks a lot like that. And so moving on, I mean, we talked a little bit about Ruto publicly looking like he bowed to pressure and withdrew the finance bill, but he didn't really withdraw the finance bill, as William so eloquently put. He basically just decided not to sign it, right? Which means that eventually it could potentially pass. And so, you know, on the broader discussion of Kenya and the United States and what they're doing, this idea of spreading peace abroad but attacking protesters at home. You know, we had mentioned this story previously, and this is kind of an update to that story, but then also kind of looking at the two elements to this, right? It is, you know, they're quote unquote spreading peace abroad in Haiti based on the U.S. request and other Western powers' request of them sending their police to Haiti but then also those same police are, in fact, killing protesters in Kenya. And so Kenyan police arrived in Haiti, in the capital of Haiti, to join UN-backed force allegedly aimed at combating quote-unquote gangs and quote-unquote restoring security. A troubling scene unfolded back home for the past 2 weeks, right? So in Nairobi, police had killed at least 30 folks, as far as we understand, on June 25th, according to the head of the Kenyan National Association, and injured dozens others while using tear gas and live ammunition during the protest of the IMF-backed finance bill. So the U.S. recently designated Kenya as a major non-NATO ally, as Inem had mentioned, and the U.S. has played a crucial role in facilitating Kenya's deployment to Haiti by providing funding and quote-unquote logistical support. So this marks the fourth foreign intervention in Haiti, with the previous mission, 2004 to 2017, marred by allegations of SA and foreign troops dumping sewage that caused a cholera outbreak that had more than 10,000 people have experienced loss of life. So despite a Kenyan court initially ruling that the police deployment was unconstitutional, as well as ongoing legal challenges and widespread public disapproval, President William Ruto's administration has pressed ahead. The juxtaposition of Kenyan officers tasked with quote-unquote bringing peace to Haiti, while also police recently attacking protesters in Nairobi, underlines a glaring contradiction. So I think we should go to this video that kind of gives more context to this, and then we'll have some more commentary on the other side.
Officers arrived in Haiti's capital. Their colleagues in Nairobi killed at least 22 protesters. They also injured dozens more after firing tear gas and live ammunition. This comes on the heels of the US designating Kenya as a major non-NATO ally. Washington was instrumental in pushing Kenya's deployment to Haiti, providing funding and logistical support. Now, 400 Kenyan police officers are part of a UN-backed force, allegedly tasked to fight gangs and restore security to the Caribbean country. This is the fourth foreign intervention in Haiti. The last UN mission was tainted by allegations of sexual assault and an outbreak of cholera, which killed at least 10,000 people. A Kenyan court earlier had deemed the police deployment unconstitutional, and it is still subject to legal proceedings. Yet, President William Ruto's government moves against the will of its people abroad and at home. Is Ruto not throwing rocks through a glass house by sending Kenyan officers to supposedly bring peace in Haiti as they shoot their own in Nairobi?
Yes, all great questions, and there's a question on the screen, right? What does a non-NATO ally even mean? So maybe we should answer that question first, and then Inem, if you can answer that question, and then William, I'll throw it to you to give your thoughts on this whole idea of spreading peace abroad but killing your own citizens. But yeah, first, Inem, if you could speak a little bit to what a non-NATO ally means.
Yeah, so, my best understanding of this is, a non-NATO ally is basically like the closest type of official alliance you can have with the United States without being in NATO. And Kenya can't be in NATO because NATO has a sort of geographic parameter. It's North Atlantic. And so it doesn't qualify. It's really a way of saying like North American and Western European countries for the most part, some exception to other parts of Europe as well. But Kenya doesn't qualify to actually be in NATO. And Kenya is like, it's not an imperialist country. So it just doesn't fit into that category of being, with those sort of big imperialist powers. But it's basically saying that it's going to be as closely aligned with US and NATO policy as a non-NATO country can be, that's in that sort of neo-colonial type of position. And so it's a really neo-colonial relationship where Kenya is basically saying that it's going to be officially submissive to US, sort of geopolitical strategy and foreign policy.
Right. Almost like I'll take your money and follow your instructions. Thank you very much. And so on that, William, how does that look to you on the ground? As we've already seen, it was deemed unconstitutional. It's not popular publicly, yet it still happened, right? President Ruto still sent the troops at the request of the United States. To you, what is that? How do you see that as someone living on the ground, and your conversations with folks on the ground as well?
I think first is maybe to expose American hypocrisy. They say they support democracies. They say they support strong institutions that factor in the will of the people. There was zero public participation about whether Kenya's police should be sent to Haiti. Moving a little further from that, when President Ruto stood at the United Nations General Assembly last year and said it's a moral obligation, it's a Pan-African duty to stand for Haiti, and he pointed it pretty well. Haiti's problem is that it's been subjugated, except he conveniently left out who subjugated Haiti. Because if he did that, then he'd realize that the very person he's taking money from is the very reason Haiti is in shambles today. If President Ruto was serious about standing up for Haiti, it being a moral duty, Haiti today is being fed rice that has high levels of arsenic, which causes diabetes, causes cancer, that comes from the US. The very same US, which heavily subsidizes its rice growers, told Haiti to stop subsidizing its farms. Basically, American rice was more competitive in Haiti than Haiti rice. And today we see the consequences of that, where Haiti can no longer grow its rice crop. Though we are seeing them coming back, we see the construction of the canals along Massacre River. We see the farms which have now started producing rice again, which is a welcome break or a welcome return. But before that, we see Haiti's ability to grow its own food was destroyed again by IMF policies, which told the country, stop subsidizing your farmers, but us as Americans, we won't stop subsidizing ours. Which means, and on top of that, after you stop subsidizing your farmers, you have to open your markets so that our rice can easily get into your land. So Haiti's agriculture capability was destroyed, and now they're basically dependent on American rice. But you don't see President Ruto looking at all this, despite him indicating that he knows its subjugation of Haiti. When he mentioned that, he didn't mention that Haiti was forced to pay reparations to France, of which we saw him basically, laughing with Macron. You'd think he'd at least mention this. He didn't mention that the US stole all of Haiti's gold, or that the US deposed leaders like Aristide and installed puppets like Duvalier. None of these at all factors in Ruto's rationale for sending Kenya's police to Haiti. So I think it shows a really dark level of, psychopathy, because you understand what the problem is, but you're willing to go in bed with the same person creating the same problems and take money from them to keep on furthering their interest in Haiti. Because it's not Kenya that just woke up and decided, I want to go to Haiti. Actually, there's a former envoy of the US to Haiti. There's an article I read sometime last week that basically said it was the American ambassador's idea to send Kenyan police to Haiti. Her rationale was that Kenya is a poor country and will love, this is basically a cash cow. Not for Kenya, of course, but for the elite. And there's no better example of this than the police was sent to Haiti, was supposed to receive 100,000 Kenya shillings. They received 20. So everyone's getting screwed here except, Ruto and Biden probably.
Well put. Any thoughts on this dichotomy between the two from your perspective, Inam?
I think it's just unfortunate to see the way that the current U.S. strategy in Haiti they call it the core group. It's usually like U.S., France, and Canada, with a couple other countries that have intervened in Haiti. Their new strategy is to just you pit Africans against each other, which is an old strategy. It's a colonial strategy, divide and conquer and all that. But I don't know. I think it's an awful thing. It's good for them, like optics wise, but it's just very rough on the Pan-African movement. And so I think it's actually probably very hopeful to see that that Kenyans are protesting against the same government. Hopefully that makes it clear that to the people who are in Haiti and other places that the Kenyan government is not acting out of the interest at all of Kenyans. And so it's that reality of both foreign and domestic policy kind of being aligned in a way that screws over really regular working people. So yeah, Haitians are very clear that they don't want any intervention whether from, Africa or from, the core group. And so, and I'm curious, also real quick to ask William a question as to whether or not this has shaped the protests in Kenya. Like if this is also part of some of the calls, regarding Kenya's foreign policy in Haiti, if that's part of the cries around some of these protests as well, or if it's just more focused on the tax reform exclusively.
I feel Kenya's general population is a bit disengaged from its foreign policy. Foreign policy, for example, is almost never a campaign item. For example, you don't see candidates, say, when you elect me into office, I'll break ties with Israel, I'll support Palestinian liberation, I'll condemn American occupation or American subjugation of Haiti. None of this. Basically, for Kenya's foreign policy is usually the reserve of government, which is now dangerous because it's now left to the government. And in our case, our foreign policy is heavily transactional. It's basically scratch my back, I scratch yours. The very first day President Ruto got into office, he moved to close the embassy of Western Sahara simply because Morocco was giving him fertilizer. So that set the tone, I feel, from there on out. And so it didn't really feature as part of our protest, but I feel going forward, as Kenyans, even before these protests, I feel not just for the foreign policy, even economic-wise, Kenyans weren't really that engaged. But this changed matters, and I really hope that it not only changed the way we think about our local or our policies, our policies at home, but also wider. How do we relate with other countries? What is our role? Because, for example, what is Kenya doing in Somalia? The argument is that we are there to fight Al-Shabaab. But if you look a bit deeper, how did Al-Shabaab come to be? Before 2006, Al-Shabaab was not in the same form it's in today. There was the Islamic Courts Union, which basically was the period of time where Somalia gained a semblance of stability after Siad Barre was deposed in 1991. But the Americans, through the Ethiopians, invaded Somalia and overthrew the Islamic Courts Union. In the vacuum there, that's where Al-Shabaab emerged. But you saw last year, Kenya signed a defense agreement with the United States, basically under the guise of fighting terrorism. You're fighting terrorism with the very same actor that created, these hostile forces, the very same actors who created the Taliban, who created Al-Qaeda, who created ISIS. How does that make sense at all? So I feel Kenya's disengagement from what the government is doing, be it foreign policy or local policy, has consequences for us as well. So for this one, Haiti didn't really feature much in our protest, though progressive forces in the country highlighted the plight of Haiti, tried to connect the police brutality we were seeing on the streets, trying to say this exact trait is what they're sending to Haiti. This very colonial force that doesn't regard other Black people as human, just sees them as donkeys to be beat, people to be shot. That's the very same thing that they're trying to export to Haiti. It's basically a way to subjugate Haiti.
Wow, well put. It's tough because I think the calculus was for Biden, I'm sure, and the United States was that if one African country goes to another diaspora country and this happens, they won't see it as America or the West doing it, right? Because it's almost like Black on Black crime gets ignored, regardless of where it's happening around the world, right? So if we don't send troops or we don't send folks, we will not be held responsible. It'll just look like, Black people fighting each other, the same way the Middle East looks to many of those in the West. It's unfortunate. It was deliberate, but unfortunate, and it's and you guys have said it all. I just thought I would add that element. Now moving from East Africa to West Africa, there's been a lot happening in Mali and Niger, and the reason why Inem was unable to join the live the last couple of weeks was because she was reporting from the ground. And I think what we want to start with is Nigerians rallying around the revolutionary government. So while we were reporting on what was happening in Kenya, on June 21st, 2024, people gathered in front of the National Assembly in Niger to express their support for the country's revolutionary government, aka the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, led by President Tiani. African Stream journalist Inem attended the rally to learn more about why participants were backing the CNSP, which came to power via a coup in July of 2023. Those interviewed expressed support for the Alliance of Sahel States, or the AES, a security pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, which is in track to develop into a confederation. It's on track to develop into a confederation. So many also said that the AES was a step in the right direction of total unification of the African continent. Let's jump into a video, and I'd love to get your commentary on the other side.
Nourrir. Notre pays est vaste. On a la main d'œuvre qualifiée. On n'a pas besoin d'attendre qu'un commerçant aille payer du riz ailleurs pour venir mettre son prix, vendre au Nigérien. On va produire notre riz nous-mêmes. Et l'on a marre.
I'm on the ground in front of the National Assembly here in Niamey, Niger, where there was just a large-scale mobilization.
Vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que depuis le 26 juillet 2023, le Niger s'est lancé dans la quête de sa souveraineté, sa dignité. Donc, c'est pour confirmer notre soutien, notre engagement à accompagner nos nouvelles autorités du CNSP jusqu'à la victoire totale et finale de notre souveraineté. Car la dignité n'a pas de prix. Et c'est la lutte libère.
C'est un soutien au Conseil national de la sauvegarde de la patrie. Et vous devrez savoir également que hier soir, notre pays a retiré un permis important à la société Orano, la société française Orano. Donc je pense que tout ceci a fait que beaucoup de gens se sont mobilisés aujourd'hui pour apporter donc leur soutien donc à nos dirigeants.
Une manifestation, un meeting organisé par un collectif des organisations de la société civile. Donc c'est une manière de manifester davantage notre soutien à l'endroit de nos autorités du CNSP au Niger. Aussi une manière de montrer à l'opinion nationale et internationale que nous défendons jusque-là, vaille que vaille, le processus de la transition. Et vous l'avez constaté, la population était sortie à Niamey et aussi dans les autres régions.
Je suis là parce que je suis une patriote. Et je suis là pour la souveraineté de mon pays. Vous n'êtes pas ça le savoir, ça fait pendant combien d'années nous n'avons pas une autre liberté. Donc maintenant, bravo, nous avons une autre liberté. Et voilà pourquoi dès qu'on nous invite à des manifestations, nous venons.
All right, so that was Inem's reporting from Niger. And obviously, it does mirror what we were seeing in Burkina Faso. And obviously, that's where Inem is located. But as I mentioned, she was on the ground in Niger to report on this story. So Inem, I mean, you and I have spoken separately about your experience in Niger. I'd love for you to speak about that here, right? I mean, we talked about, I'll turn the floor over to you. You had a lot to say, so I'd love to hear from you and what you found while you were there.
Yeah, I mean, Niger is an incredible country, and I think it's extremely underrated. I think a lot of people, even within the AES and the Sahel, focus a lot on Burkina Faso because there's this history of Thomas Sankara and something that some people know about. So even me myself personally, I was surprised to see just the level of revolutionary spirit and consciousness in Niger, and just how well organized people are. So that mobilization that I went to, I didn't plan to go. It's like I stumbled upon it. And that's kind of the reality in Niamey. It's like you walk around and you just stumble upon all these events that are happening all the time in support of the CNSP government. And so it's very impressive. And you notice, the video, there were 2 women that spoke out. And that's a huge thing I noticed in Niger, is that women are very, very well organized. I got to meet and interview women who are part of women's organizations that have thousands of members, women who are organizing against imperialism, which honestly is not something that I see in a lot of African countries, maybe a lot of countries worldwide. But it was a huge, huge thing that I noticed in Niger is that, the women were very, very engaged. They were very politically educated. That woman at the end who said, "Only the struggle could free us, seule la lutte libère," that's actually a very famous Thomas Sankara quote. So she's referencing Thomas Sankara when she said that. And these are just like a few different sound bites that I put together to talk specifically about Niger's context and the CNSP. But there's a lot that I couldn't put in that 2-minute video, and so I'm hoping to go back, make other videos with other sound bites. But people talked a lot about Pan-Africanism. They talked about the need for Africa to be totally unified. That was a major theme. And hopefully we can get into like another video that also will talk about this in a different country. But that same very that pro-AES spirit is a very Pan-African one. It's not one that stops at the 3 countries, but has like this very clear consciousness and understanding that the AES is just the beginning, and that all of Africa will unite and join the AES. And then another comment on that is the second person who I interviewed in that video talked about Orano, the French mining company, getting kicked out of one of their major mines, uranium mines in Niger, which is something that I was in Niger while that was happening. And I think it's just another example of the amount of progress that's being made. This is a really, really big deal. Historically, a third of French households have relied on Niger's uranium for their electricity supply. And then I always like to talk about how the Eiffel Tower itself, if you ever see like pictures of the Eiffel Tower at night, or if you've been to Paris, you've seen, the Eiffel Tower lit up at night, this symbol of France, it uses uranium from Niger, again, as an energy source to light up the literal symbol of France. And Niger has one of the lowest electricity supplies, for its population in the world. And so to see such a big move, I think it's a huge thing. And people are talking about how this is the beginning, and that the CNSP is expected to nationalize the entire uranium sector, and we already see that the AES is focusing on refining and working with the uranium in the Sahel, with these nuclear power plants that are being created in both Mali and Burkina Faso. So not only will we have control over the mines, but also, the actual transformation of the uranium into a source of nuclear energy will be under Sahel control. There's so much I can say. I'll limit myself a little bit, but just to add a couple more things in about that point. I went to the National Museum of Niger, and they had a lot of cultural artifacts, historical artifacts, but one thing that stood out to me is that they had this whole exhibit about how uranium is mined, how it's transformed into a nuclear energy source, who has historically controlled the uranium, who ought to control the uranium. I'll be honest, I've been to many museums in West Africa. I don't think I've ever been to one that had that sort of a hard science focus. It was like getting into the nitty gritty of how nuclear energy is created. I've never been to a museum like that. Even in the West, I don't think I've been to a museum like that. So I think, that really stood out to me that, they're doing that kind of education publicly. And then last comment on this, we also are seeing right now this resurgence in France at the same time of the far right that's happening. And it's interesting to see one of their talking points. There's a lot in the conversation of the political landscape in France right now. A lot of the conversation is about the increasing energy prices and, France's energy supply, but France doesn't have its own energy supply. What they're actually talking about, in parentheses, is Niger's uranium and other sources of energy that come from the African continent. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see sort of what happens geopolitically and globally as Niger continues to move forward and nationalize its uranium.
Well put, and really interesting. Just to see Niger, the support for their new president or the new leadership. I think in the interest of time, we'll jump into the Mali story. And then after that, I'd love to hear from William as well, just to kind of get the contrast of what you're seeing from being in the East. But let me give some context first. We'll jump into the video and then we'll do some commentary on the other side. So on the 25th of June, the revolutionary president of the Republic of Mali, Goita, landed in Burkina Faso. Since he came to power in 2021, in a 2021 military coup, this is Goita's first trip to another African country and his second trip outside of Mali. Burkina Faso's government announced Goita would arrive the day before his voyage, spurring Burkinabe into action across Ouagadougou to prepare to welcome him. The Citizens Night Watch, which Inem has mentioned previously, a civil society organization that serves as the eyes and ears of the revolution that kicked off with the military coup in 2022 in Burkina Faso, rallied all night from sundown to sunrise to build support and to raise awareness of Goita's visit. So Inem spoke to supporters awaiting Goita's arrival at Thomas Sankara International Airport in Ouagadougou. So let's get to that video.
I am currently at the Thomas Sankara International Airport in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, where Burkinabe citizens have mobilized to welcome the arrival of the President of the Republic of Mali, Assimi Goïta, and to express their support for the alliance of Sahel states.
Bon, depuis hier qu'on attendit les Assimi Goïta vient, on n'a pas assis, on n'a pas dormi. Même moi, j'ai réveillé 4 heures du matin, on commençait à sensibiliser, mobiliser les gens pour qu'ils n'aient qu'à venir. Et donc, on a fait beaucoup de travail. Et puis, on a bien content parce que c'est un président d'Afrique. Donc, ce n'est pas les Mali seulement, tous les Afriques.
Vraiment, on est vraiment contente parce que notre idole Assimi Goïta est venu au Burkina Faso. On est venu pour l'accueillir parce qu'on est content avec lui, parce qu'il est venu pour sauver l'Afrique entière. Et on fait un. Burkina, Mali, c'est le même pays. Il n'y a pas... C'est les frontières, hein. C'est les Blancs qui ont venu mettre les frontières divisées. Sinon, on n'est qu'un seul pays. Ah, l'AES va grandir. Ça va prendre toute l'Afrique. Ce n'est pas les 3 pays là seulement, c'est toute l'Afrique qui va rentrer dans l'AES. On les attend aussi.
Vraiment, il a un bon caractère. Depuis qu'il a pris le pouvoir, il amène l'Afrique sur le bon chemin. Donc son frère aussi a pris l'exemple. Notre capitaine Ibrahim Traoré, qui a pris l'exemple avec lui.
Ba ne wakata kwele man yamna mikamti ziga pidamen pidi wuligamti ya ne banda zingi ngur kwai nin ha wasa ya Assimi Goïta kwa na ye kabna tara Assimi Goïta ya ne ba yibiya Burkina ma an pasi ni je na ba Abdurrahman Kani ne ba mana man kita nusi an vudu tem san da Burkina zingi vudu tem da revolution la so men zingi ane bo nya ba te ton metete kalaka tem sa ta na kasan pasa me te wata na ta ti Afrika fara wa
ya shida migam tirunna muhammadu jwadi yinkuru kaberere rara tame ya rar han kan winna tabe ya rabidren ku ayesa temse migam ti president Assimi Goïta ya pipi visite Africa porti na Burkina Faso wa Burkina Faso leader me pipi visite Africa porti Mali.
I mean, it's great to see how excited people were to his arrival. What was it like for you on the ground, Inem, and talking to folks, and what was the general sentiment that you got from them? I mean, they seem very educated on what's happening. It's his first trip outside of to another African country, something I don't think most people would know, but it seems like the people on the ground there know. But what was your experience like talking to folks and kind of hearing about his arrival?
I mean, first of all, so this was surreal because for security measures, they don't really share much in advance, like that when he was coming. It was something that happened. It was like announced the day before, and so that's why they said that they stayed up all night. They organized the people, they mobilized to prepare people to come to the airport. So I was in Niger, and I have my flight scheduled to come back to Burkina, and I have no idea that Assimi Goïta is coming. And it just so happens that I arrive at the airport like about 45 minutes or so before Assimi Goïta is scheduled to arrive. So I actually had my suitcases waiting like on the other side. Like I just dropped them off with some ladies at the restaurant, and I ran to go interview people because it was just the energy was so exciting and ecstatic. But I know it's the same spirit that I see across the Alliance of Sahel states. People are very clear. They believe that we have 3 presidents. Assimi Goita, like Ibrahim Traore, and like Abdurrahman Chani, they are all our presidents. So people are like, okay, our president is coming for the first time. And they are paying very, very close attention to all of these developments in the AES. So they knew that, Assimi Goita has not traveled to other African countries. He really hasn't traveled internationally at all from as far as I know, except to go to Russia. So he went to that Russia-Africa summit. And apart from that, I don't think that he's really done much international travel. So this was a very big deal, and people were very excited. And as they pointed out, Ibrahim Traore's first visit to an African country was also to Mali. And so they have this very, very significant spirit of unity. And like I said in the last video, and you can see it very clearly articulated here, multiple people in this video said that all of Africa is going to unite, all of Africa is going to join the AES or join in this process of African unity. And so I think I think that actually the protesters say it better than I could even say it. And I guess to add us one thing is in the following sort of week since that happened, Abdoulaye Diop, who is Mali's Minister of Foreign Affairs, spoke publicly saying that while the AES is working on this project of creating a confederation, it's only as they've said in the previous, year or so, it's a step towards an actual federation. So they see this as a step to create a confederation that will lead to an actual federal state, an actual shared state that would abolish these colonial borders and actually create a unification within the AES. So what's happening here, it's a really big deal. I think that there will be, international geopolitical sort of repercussions from those who do not see it as in their interest for African people to unify and for African people to control their resources. But I think it's just so important that Africans everywhere pay very close attention. There's a lot of propaganda right now from Western media outlets claiming all sorts of bogus things about all three countries, but to really pay attention to what the majority of the people on the ground are saying, and those videos really reflect the opinions of the majority. As somebody who lives here, I can say this is not some fringe thing. This really reflects, how the average person feels in Ouagadougou and in Niamey.
Well put, and I know that you have to go. So I don't know if there's any final words that you want to offer before we get William's thoughts and we bring this thing to a close. But I know you have to go, so I wanted to give you the moment to say whatever else you wanted to say before we go.
Okay, just as a final word, I filmed in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Niger. So keep your eyes open. There'll be more AES videos coming out. There's another one coming out today or tomorrow about the Citizens Night Watch. So keep paying attention, follow the AES, and just don't buy into anything that BBC or France 24 or Radio France International, even Al Jazeera. Don't listen to them and tune into African Stream for the AES coverage.
There it is. People on the ground is speaking directly to folks. Thanks, Inam. I really appreciate your contribution. Really good insight and information. Okay, so William, as someone in East Africa, in Kenya, who you have protests happening, what does it feel like to see what's happening with the AES and how people are so supportive of this? What they're saying is eventually going to become a federation, one country from these three. How do you see that from your perspective, where you are sitting in Nairobi?
I think in both East and West Africa, we have two historical events taking place. And they're similar, but I feel for the Sahel, for the AES, they're a bit further ahead. They've reclaimed their state, they're firmly in control of their country. But for us, we are still at the stage where we've recognized this is our shared enemy, and these are our shared interests, and this is how we are approaching the problem. So they are a bit ahead, and I feel as a Kenyan, because we do have a bit of doomers as well here, Since it's an African country, they don't really see much good coming out of it. But I feel, look, the Sahel, for example, Mali is creating West Africa's biggest gold refinery. Mali is one of Africa's biggest gold producers. You have Burkina Faso, you have Niger, Burkina Faso with a nuclear plant. You have Niger, which has the uranium. So all these countries in that federation, the potential for growth, I feel, is immense. And the fact that, France had hindered them for so long is really a dark stain on Africans everywhere. So for myself, as a Kenyan, I am very, very inspired by what's happening in the Sahel. I look at it as a model for what we can as well, do to bring back our countries. Inem mentioned, the fact that the women in
Okay, I think we lost William's connection. Yes. So he was just speaking to the fact that the women in Niger are very involved in the political protests and things of that nature. I think that was where he was last going to make a statement. We'll give it a moment to see if William's able to come back. In the meantime, let me just give my thoughts. As someone who has lived in West Africa for 3 years, American-born Sierra Leonean, I have not only been heartened by what I see in what's happening in Kenya. Hopefully, we'll see eventually a change in political direction, but also what we've been able to see in the Sahel, where they've actually been able to kind of actualize some of the things that they had been talking about and hoping for. And so, overall, it's amazing to see, revolutions taking place and actually leading to actual change. And, we look forward to seeing more of that on the continent. I think we've lost William, unfortunately, and Inem had to go. And so, we want to thank you guys all for watching. Hopefully you found this helpful, giving context to the stories that are happening around the continent of Africa. You can expect that over the next couple of days, there'll be more stories, as Ina mentioned, about what's happening in Sahel. And we will continue to keep you guys abreast of what's going on in Kenya as this, this tax bill and also the protests happening there. So we'll just continue to keep you guys posted. So stay tuned to African Stream and Authentic African. Make sure you subscribe to both channels on YouTube. You follow them both on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, wherever you can find us. And make sure you like. If you found this video helpful, hit that thumbs up so that, we can get this out to more people. Share this with anybody who could use this kind of insight and information. And make sure that you turn on your post notifications so you're notified every time a new post comes out. And with that, thanks for watching. We will see you guys all next week.